I'm Johnny Wentworth, the Environment Advisor in the Parliamentary Office of Science Technology, or POST, as it says on the slide there. POST supports evidence-based scrutiny of parliamentary select committees, as it says on the poster behind me, bridging research and UK Parliament. And one aspect of this includes supporting knowledge exchange between Parliament and research through fellowships for academics from the early career to more senior. By way of declaration, I'm a member of the network and also the British Ecological Society Policy Committee. And this event is hosted by the Civil Service Environment and Climate Network and the BES.
Is it working now?
Well, I don't know.
The Civil Service Environment Network brings together 7,000 civil servants from 120 UK government departments and agencies. Our mission is the mission of the network is to break down government silos and build environmental knowledge and policy capability across the civil service. The BES is a members society with a vision for nature and people to thrive in a world inspired by ecology. Their policy team works to advise government on environmental issues using the expertise of ecologists who are their members. Today, we are joined by 2 ecologists and 2 policy advisors who will explore the challenges of engaging with each other, maintaining those relationships, working to their differing timeframes and more. So we're first going to hear from the panel, and then there'll be time for the panel to answer your questions. There's a link to Slido in the chat where you can add your questions and upvote other people's questions. This session is being recorded and will be made available on the CSEN website and the BES social media channels after the event. First up, we have Dr. Nick Isaac, a macroecologist from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and Hannah Hudson, a science advisor at Defra. Nick and Hannah worked together on Defra's environmental targets published at the end of last year. Take it away, Nick.
Thanks, Johnny. And for full disclosure, I'm also a member of the BES Policy Committee. So the slides that you're looking at are on my screen. Hannah's going to talk about the first few, and then I'll talk about the detail of the implementation. So yes, we're the target that the topic that we're talking about though is how we co-developed what became a legally binding target for species abundance, and with the aim of trying to bend the curve of species abundance. So I'm going to allow Hannah to talk about the Environment Act and the targets and the policy process.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, so the Environment Act, it came into force in 2021, and it's a vehicle for delivering the ambitions of the 25-year Environment Plan, which was published in 2018 and has since been updated in the Environmental Improvement Plan, which was published earlier this year. And it creates a provision essentially for legally binding targets for England. And the kind of legal aspect of this is set out in the statutory instrument, which was laid on the 19th of December 2022. And essentially what it sets out is that there has to be at least one long-term target, which was kind of defined as spanning more than 15 years, and that there had to be one target for air quality, for waste reduction, for water, and for biodiversity. So if you can go on to the next slide, Nick. So I'm going to be talking right now about the biodiversity targets. That's a team that I work in, the National Biodiversity Evidence and Analysis team. And then Nick's going to talk a bit more about one specific target. So we have 4 targets under the Environment Act. The first is to halt the decline of species abundance by 2030. The second is to ensure that species abundance in 2042 is greater than in 2022 and at least 10% greater than 2030. The third is to improve the red list index for England for species extinction risk by 2042 compared to 2022 levels. And the final one is an action-based target, which is to restore or create in excess of 500,000 hectares of a range of wildlife-rich habitat outside of protected sites by 2042 compared to 2022 levels. And then alongside those statutory, legally binding targets, there are also interim targets which aren't statutory in the same way, but they kind of all link in as set out in the Environmental Improvement Plan, so the EIP, and those interim targets have a deadline of the 31st of January 2028, and they are to restore or create 140,000 hectares, so kind of a shorter term version of the 500,000 hectares. And as well for all SSSIs, so sites of special scientific interest, to have an up-to-date condition assessment, and for 50% of SSSIs to have actions on track and to achieve favourable condition. So Nick, if you can go on to the next slide. What I'm just wanting to set out here is kind of the process of that whole setting of those targets. So in the centre left there, you've got National Biodiversity, which is the team that I'm in, and that is both evidence and policy colleagues. And we worked with CEH, and it was a kind of collaborative kind of piece of work, but that wasn't the only element that Nick and I worked within. We're also working with arm's length bodies. So for example, Natural England or Environment Agency. We're also working with other Defra evidence and policy teams, for example, those teams that had their own targets or teams that would contribute towards the success of our targets. There's also kind of processes with legal colleagues setting out the statutory instrument. And we had kind of engagement with stakeholders as well over the period of that process. And once you kind of got to a certain stage, we then took that to what's a Biodiversity Targets advisory group, and they would advise and basically give us feedback on the progress that we're making and the decisions. And that then gets taken, once that's kind of agreed, that then gets taken to a Biodiversity Targets board, which has a chair and requires sign-off from the director. And then that follows on to ministers and Secretary of State. Once that's all approved, that then has to go for a right round, which is to other government departments. And then following that right round, we had a public consultation, which lasted 12 weeks. And then after that public consultation, with the feedback that we got from that, we then kind of go back to that process on the left-hand side again, where we have those conversations with all those other teams. And we then go through those kind of red arrows again to kind of get that final. And at the end of that, that's when we got the statutory instrument laid. So that's the kind of targets area. And I'll now hand over to Nick to kind of talk about the specifics of the species abundance target and the work that they did.
Thanks, Hannah. So I'm going to very briefly run through the actual details of the target and the index. So the two targets for abundance are written here on the right: to halt the decline in species abundance by 2030 and to increase it by 10% by 2042 compared with 2030 levels. And what's shown on the left is a draft version of the index that we created. It's not the final version, that has not yet been published. This is the version that went into the consultation document, which Hannah mentioned, the consultation that took place about a year ago. So this is already about a year out of date. So I'm going to give you a very quick tour of how this index came to be and the sort of feedback between the index and the targets. So right away, we wanted to have an index of species abundance that was representative of England. So we needed to have data sets that broadly spanned England. So we have in this country some wonderful data sets for a broad range of taxonomic groups, and many of them are shown here. And I'm not going to read them out because we don't have time. But you can see that there are some groups like birds that are covered very well. Other groups that you may be less familiar with also have monitoring schemes. Very briefly about how I see us, UKCH, fitting in. We work very closely with Defra and JNCC and the other agencies, but we also work very closely and directly with the people who actually generate those data, Many of them are generated by citizen science groups. Many of those are run by NGOs and organizations and charitable organizations, such as shown in this slide. The general principle is that we have some observations of wildlife, which is over on the left, and we're going to try and produce something over on the right, which is an index of the change in status species. And we have to go through these different steps along the way with data, statistical analyses, to produce some kind of high-level composite summary. And so most of the research is about the bits in the middle that join up from observations to indicators. Now, the index that we ended up with was based upon, its genesis comes from the UK Priority Species Index. It's an index of 224 species of birds, bats, butterflies, and moths, and a few other larger mammals as well. It's been around for nearly a decade, and this shows one of the recent implementations of it. There's also an England version based on a slightly smaller set of species. So these are species that are known to be conservation priorities. So one of the first things we did was reproduce the same index, but for all of the species in these taxonomic groups. That came to about 700. We then realized that we could easily expand the taxonomic coverage to include plants and freshwater invertebrates. And that's what gives you this index of 1,000 species shown here. And the index, crucially, is the geometric mean of all of the species abundance. And what that means is that if half the species increase or half the species double in abundance and half of them decline by 50%, then the index will stay the same. So it's a balance. There are some groups that really aren't covered, or at least weren't covered when we did the consultation. We've tried to expand that further. We've now got some fish in there, some bumblebees. So we've been searching out new data sets to try and make it more representative. And then the last couple of slides are on the level of ambition, because one of the key discussions going back and forward was, well, this is going to be a legally binding target. It needs to be both ambitious, but it also needs to be realistic, because there's no point setting something into law if it can't be achieved. So we looked at the long-term decline, which is a 52% decline in abundance, and the recent decline, which is about a 2% per year drop. And then starting to map that against the targets, what you see is that if we just extrapolate that 2% per year decline, you see a red business as usual trajectory. And then to meet the two targets, you'd need to follow something approximating the green line. They may not look that different, but if you zoom in, you can see, this is the same graph plotted on different scale. You can see that actually to bend that curve away from the red business as usual line is actually fairly ambitious. So we need to flatten the line by 2030 to halt those declines, and then to increase species abundance by 2042. And that is the end of the slideshow.
Okay, so we are now going to move to our next panelists, Dr. Deepa Sinapathi, Head of Department of Sustainable Land Management at the University of Reading, and Mark Stevenson, Head of Nature Recovery at the Forestry Commission, previously Policy Advisor at Defra, leading on nature and pollinator strategies. Deepa and Mark worked together on the evaluation of the Biodiversity 2020 strategy, particularly the progress made towards targets related to climate change. Okay.
Right. So I think I'm going first, Deepa. So hello, everyone. A slight change in tack, because this is going to be a slightly broader set of talks and we haven't got so many slides. So as Johnny said, I'm Mark Stevenson. I'm now Head of Nature Recovery in the Policy and Advice team at the Forestry Commission. Prior to that, I was Deputy Head of Division at Defra, Biodiversity and Ivory. Before that, yeah, I was the biodiversity lead the policy lead for both biodiversity and pollinators. I should also say, and that's where I work with Deepa, and actually Nick as well. I mean, Nick was involved in the evaluation of the previous strategy. I'm also an ex-researcher myself, so I spent the first part of my career within CEH, moved into a science role within Defra, and then into policy that way. and actually went back to university lecturing after that before coming to the Forestry Commission. So you can dip in and out. I wouldn't necessarily advise it for your kind of mental health, going through probation continually, but it can be done. I think what I want to do by way of introduction is just sort of take a step back. So I think I'm here as the kind of policy maker representative. I just want to ask a couple of questions. I haven't got slides, so imagine two slides, one with a big question mark on and one with a big circle on. The question mark is what do we mean by policy? I think we mystify it too much, and I just want to tackle that. And the second one is, what's the process that you go through to make a policy? And how does the steps in that process affect the type of scientific evidence or other evidence that you need? So to start with the question mark. So I thought, define policy, I'll just Google it and I'll just use the government definition. Actually, I found at least 5 definitions. BES has got its own definition, which is different again. And what they have in common is a policy is an agreement about a set of goals to pursue and a mechanism by which to pursue them. And I quite like that. And I think that's all it breaks down to. It's a decision. And actually, Defra was a giant sausage decision-making machine. You're trying to decide whether to commit resources to achieving a particular end and how you're going to allocate those resources to what mechanism or what we would call policy measure. And those measures are, you can legislate, you can incentivize, you can tax, you can use your convening power, you can work through partnerships, you can use codes of practice, you can run communication campaigns. So you have these tools, and the policy is a decision to allocate resources to a goal and then to use those tools. The only other thing I wanted to say is, who makes policy? We used to call ourselves policy makers, but civil servants are not policy makers, we're policy advisors. A minister is the only person that can make a decision to allocate resources because they can be held accountable. What a civil servant does is puts all of that evidence together to advise them, and it's evidence from economists, from lawyers, from scientists, from the general public, so that those decisions are kind of informed. In terms of the process, so this is where we move on to a slide with a big circle on. Although watching Hannah's presentation, I think it's wrong to think that you go around the circle or any of the steps in order. You go backwards and forwards, but you normally start by defining the issue. What's the problem? Should government intervene? Why should it intervene? And to what end? Actually, and you've just seen a very good example of that in the kind of targets work. You then move on to a stage which is normally called options appraisal. You're exploring the options. So you're looking at how you've made a decision that you need to act. You then start to look at how you might want to act. What would be the most effective mechanisms? Then you're moving on to an implementation phase. You've selected your mechanism. You're putting it in place. Sorry, someone just muted me. It's happened before. Yeah, so then you move around to monitoring and then to evaluation, and there is a difference. Monitoring is looking to see whether you're meeting your goal. Evaluation is much more whether you've got the right mix of policies and activities. So really, you're trying to link them back to, and with biodiversity, that has always been really difficult. Biodiversity is responding to a whole complex range of both government policy, economic activity, climate change, and everything else. Trying to tease out which policies are having an impact has always been a challenge. And then you're back around the cycle again. And you need different evidence at different points of that cycle. So when you're at the start, much as where we were with the targets, often you're using synthesis of information. Of course, those syntheses rely on primary research. So even if you're just publishing stuff in the scientific literature, that's really important. That is informing policy, but it tends to be synthesized before policymakers use it. Sometimes that's through reports, sometimes that's through advisory committees. When you're exploring options, actually economics comes into it much more. There are kind of really big economic implications of different policy instruments. But you might also be looking at likelihood of success. You might be reviewing what's happened in the past, what's been happening in other countries. Monitoring is much more about what you're putting together in terms of data. and evaluation is linking that back. So actually, when you get round to the evaluation stage, you're much more on the synthesis side again. And I think that's really important because actually those syntheses of information, and either through advisory committees or through reports, and importantly international reports, I would probably stress this throughout. Things like IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Ecosystem Assessment, ecosystem services rather, was really important, just as the climate change panels were. So there's international and domestic synthesis and advice. And then as you go around the cycle, it moves much more into a commissioning of individuals kind of activities type of evidence. So that's all I wanted to say. And, you know, I think DEPA saw a lot of that. Hopefully, you know, we were synthesizing evidence to inform the reviews of strategies, and we were putting together monitoring data and trying to tie that to particular delivery protocols. But anyway, DEPA, please fill in some detail.
Thanks, Mark. So yes, Ellie, if you could share my slide, just as a few points. So Mark's kind of given everybody a broad overview of how policy making and policy advice and synthesizing of evidence works. So I worked with Mark as part of a BS policy fellowship in 2017 and 2018. Now, the British Ecological Society offers these fellowships to researchers post-PhD. So it's open to postdocs or early career academics, such as lecturers, and this happens on an annual basis. And I was a postdoc when I applied for this fellowship, and we could do this as a sort of 3-month fellowship, full-time. But coming from a sort of academic background, and sort of this was my first foray into the policy world, 3 months seemed like a very short time to get my head around how things worked and to actually be able to deliver a discrete piece of work. And so we spread this out as part-time over 6 months, which I think gave it a little bit more flexibility for me to actually get to grips with how things worked, but also be able to deliver. So this, I mean, I think with the BES each year, the specific policy organization that a researcher gets to work with varies. In my case, it was working with Defra, and I worked with the nature strategy team that Mark headed at that time, and the wildlife evidence teams. And also taking into consideration the timing of the fellowship, I think as a researcher, you kind of like to think these are the areas of research I'm interested in. These are the areas that I would like to synthesize evidence, and this is the area that I can offer my expertise in. But it also has to tie in with whatever policy timeframes are happening. What are the priorities that are happening at that particular point in time? And when I got offered the fellowship, one of the key things that was happening during that time was the evaluation of the Biodiversity 2020 strategy, and sort of understanding how progress, you know, whether progress had been made towards these targets, how much progress had been made towards these targets, and you know, whether all the targets were being met or not. And even within that, the Biodiversity 2020 strategy was a huge piece of work. And so within the part-time 6-month fellowship, we sort of sat down and had discussions about how and what we might focus on. And because as a researcher, I have a particular interest towards climate change impacts on biodiversity. So we had a discussion with the policy team, and I thought, okay, we can work on those particular targets in this space of time. Having said that, again, a few months isn't enough to sort of quantitatively evaluate targets. And therefore, you sort of try and think about other ways of being able to assess progress towards targets. And one of the ways that's open is to try and bring experts together. So in this case, we followed a modified Delphi process. We had representatives from Defra from Natural England, from the Forestry Commission, from the Committee for Climate Change, but also from ecological consultancies and academic researchers and NGOs, all coming together. And we set up a semi-quantitative process by which our experts could give their opinion on whether the targets associated with climate change were being met or there was progress being made towards that. And we also gave them the flexibility to provide us a confidence score. How confident were they in their assessment? So that's how we did it. And so we did an initial round of scoring, and we brought a workshop to, we had a workshop where we brought everybody together, and the report that you see on the page on the slide there was the end result of this. And again, this was sort of what was possible to do within the time frame that we had. And I'm sure we'll have discussions on research time frames and policy time frames and how we might sort of try and bring these two things together. But the one thing I wanted to highlight also is that this was a really good opportunity for me to get my head around how policy works. But it does come down to sort of learning to speak different languages between academics and policymakers, but also building on that relationship. Mark's nature strategy team and the wildlife evidence teams were also in the process of assessing the evidence of the national pollinator strategy. So even though I finished my policy fellowship mid-2018, I then got involved in the National Pollinator Strategy evidence update as one of the researchers. And again, building on that, we were able to sort of try and synthesize evidence to go into policymaking with the National Pollinator Strategy that's been revised every 5 years. So that's really what I wanted to say, just a snapshot of the things I did while I was a policy fellow, but also what's been built on from there. And I think, yeah, I'll stop there and happy to answer questions, I think.
Okay, I think we are slightly ahead of time, so I'm going to start with the top question, which is, what is the best way for policymakers to access research? Often policymakers have not kept up with the field. What insights do policymakers get from academics? And the sort of appended question is, as an executive officer, how can I influence my team to take more input from academia, especially when a lot of academic work isn't within the public domain? And I know there's obviously an issue for us as well, in that a lot of things are behind a paywall. We were lucky enough that Post for a while was affiliated with UCL, and we had library access through that, but that's definitely the exception, and that has now gone for us as well. Who wants to kick off with that one?
I'll kick off.
Okay.
If that's helpful. So so the question is, how do policymakers stay up to date with science?
Yeah.
And I think, it's an interesting question. I will just reflect. I spent 13 years in a policy role, coming from a kind of research and science role. And in that 13 years, I published one paper. So you do rapidly get out of touch. And I would say that there are probably two main ways that policymakers can keep in touch with science. One is through the mechanisms I talked about before. Actually, policymakers will not tend to use primary research. They might if they're interested in it, but generally what they're using is either advice or synthesis. If you look at some of the things that have been really kind of impactful, so I mentioned the IPBES, so this is this intergovernmental panel, which sort of came out of the Convention on Biological Diversity, although it's separate. it's government funded. You know, government set it up. It funds its scientists to support it. It does listen. It's a slight step removed, but you would be amazed how influential that is. They produce syntheses, and I would recommend to everyone to have a read of, let's say, the pollinator report. Have a read of the synthesis. It's about 30 pages long, and I would say it's probably 29 pages too long for your average policymaker. But what it does is it sets out key conclusions, what we know, how certain we are, what we don't know, and what we're doing about it. And actually, that's the sort of level of information that policymakers will tend to use. And as I say, that can come through reports, but also, you know, the Science Advisory Committee who were involved in the decision about neonicotinoids, it's how they did things. So I think there's something on both sides. I think government needs to, you know, have these processes in place so that it can access that evidence in a synthesized, quality assured way. And scientists need to make sure that they are kind of inputting to those kind of processes as well. So that would be my starter for 10. Don't expect policymakers to keep up to date, because they won't be, and they'll have hundreds of other people shouting at them. But kind of collating and communicating science really clearly is the way to kind of have an impact. And on that impact point, well, you know, Deepa, you said it's difficult, you know, it was just quite a short time, but that evaluation piece that you put up, I can remember it very well. I can remember 3 things that came out of it. Agri-environment worked really well when it was done at scale and in detail. What else did it say? Partnerships added value, particularly with species. Pressures on biodiversity continue to increase, and biodiversity could only be tackled by tackling it across government. You look, you know, maybe it's hard to say that they directly influenced, but actually that point about agri-environment operating at scale, I think, led to the commitment to do nature recovery areas, which later morphed into the landscape recovery component of ELM. The partnerships led to the establishment of the Nature Recovery Network partnership. I think the message about mainstreaming across government was coming from lots of places, but that's central now to the environmental improvement plan. So those pieces of science, when synthesized in that way, actually did have impact. It might have taken 2 or 3 years, but they were really impactful.
As a science advisor, Hannah, have you got an opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Mark said. I think as well, as the kind of almost step in between the academia and the policy, I do like, we have learning and development budget that we can use, so you can kind of use that to try and keep up to date. I went to the BES conference in Edinburgh in December, so it's kind of like recognizing that it can go both ways. It's not just academia that has to kind of approach policy, but we can kind of go into academia's world and see what's happening that maybe isn't a policy priority right now, but could maybe develop into one, so that we can start advising to our policy colleagues, there's an increased interest in this area, we might want to pay attention to it. So I think there's lots of ways that as someone in the civil service, you can make sure that you're kept up to date, even if it's, like Mark says, you're not necessarily going to be reading those peer-reviewed journals, but you can still interact with academia in a relatively successful way.
Okay, so I move on to the next question. It's the one that Deepa mentioned. How can policymakers and ecologists effectively navigate differing timeframes? Ecological changes can take longer than political cycles or economic plans. And appended to that is, how do you cross not only departmental boundaries in policymakers, but also influence movement towards delivering long-term objectives that aren't current priorities?
Would you like me to take that, since I mentioned it? Of course. I think one of the key things is that understanding that policy is made on the evidence that's available at any given point in time, and there's always going to be knowledge gaps where research feels that there's not enough evidence to feed into policy. But I think Mark already mentioned about actually highlighting the certainties. You know, what do we know? How certain are we in terms of what we know? And I think that is the key in bridging that gap between the research evidence that's currently available, but also highlighting to policy, here are some priorities where we might not yet have the evidence, and therefore these might be the priority research areas that you might want to think about for the next year, the next 3 years, the next 10 years, and so on. So if you think purely on terms of research projects as an academic, we usually take 3 to 5 years to try and give evidence that we are 95% confident about. But having that sort of certainty and saying, this is what we know, here's a ton of evidence with a lot of certainty, here's some evidence with a lot of certainty, here's a lot of evidence, but the uncertainty is very high, and here are the big gaps where we're completely uncertain and know nothing about. And I think framing it in that actually helps both researchers and policymakers move forward and identify priorities.
Okay, anyone else want to have a go at that?
Well, I'll have a go. I mean, I think it's not a lot to say on top of what Deepa's already said. Policymakers are always having to make decisions, I mean, not just in biodiversity and climate, but across the board on the basis of a huge amount of uncertainty, and being able to identify and quantify it is the critical thing. And give you a specific example, again, going back to pollinators. When that pollinator strategy was set up, so bear in mind that policy cycle, we've already made the decision that there's an economic and I'm not sure if I'd call it moral, but kind of international obligations around biodiversity that government should act, and particularly because of the evidence that land use was driving a lot of it. We commissioned research again. It was led by Adam van Bergen at CEH, but I had various other people involved, other universities. That research actually struggled to, even with evidence that pollinators were declining. This was before we'd done a lot of the kind of modelling around occupancy. So we had limited data. Some of it was a little bit kind of, it was hard to say with certainty what was happening what was going on with pollinators, and it was even harder to say what was causing the losses that we did see. The only one that we could be reasonably confident about at that time was habitat loss. That there was work coming out of the Netherlands, for example, that showed that the loss of species rich grassland in particular was driving a lot of the declines that we could see from modelling of declines. And so that strategy that Defra put in place had two main things to start with. One was we've got to put habitat back. The other was we've got to get some more science to understand exactly what's going on with pollinator populations, which led to the creation of the National Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, and also led to the research, the large-scale field trials of neonicotinoid impacts. And then once that work had done, which must have taken 3, 4, 5 years probably, then that fed back into the kind of pollinator strategy and led to the neonicotinoid ban. So actually you make decisions on what you know, and you can still make decisions to fill the gaps that you don't have.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I would say that although yes, policy decisions are often made on quite short time frames, the same thing comes up again and again and again. So I think on the pollinators, I think we've did the first post note when I was here back in 2008, and then we've consistently done one since. Becky having done probably the most recent one on insect decline and the data sources of insect decline, and the Science and Technology Committee are about to launch an inquiry looking at insect decline again. So it goes round and around. So in a way, researchers can just wait till the next time it comes round and then put forward their evidence. Okay, so we go on to the next question. Could you describe what is a productive, positive relationship looks like? Is there a single factor that help you work most effectively together? and the appended question is, how best do you get policy officials and academics talking to each other? What are the barriers that stop this from happening? So just as an aside, from our point of view, it can be a little bit easier because we can get academics in front of select committees directly talking to politicians, but it's not necessarily quite so easy with ministers. Who's going to take that? Hannah?
I'm happy to take that. I'll let Nick go first. I think he was already unmuting.
All right, okay.
So I think there's a thing that's quite hard for scientists to understand. So a lot of science is based upon relationships. It's based upon bilateral collaboration between individuals and teams. And the way that policy generally works is between organizations and groups within larger organizations. And the turnover of personnel in particular in civil services is really quite high. And that as from somebody working in the academic sector, that's really quite hard to understand, that there can be a different person doing the same job. One of the things that has been particularly good in the topic that we discussed was having that relationship over a 2-year period and being able to understand more about the constraints that the civil service work under, and so building a long-term relationship actually was one of the things that really, I think, made it successful. But that doesn't always, the circumstances don't always allow that to happen.
Yeah, I guess to follow on from that, I would agree, and the kind of open conversations, whether you feel like you can have those open conversations with who is essentially a contractor. So there is a contract and there are conditions to that, but to feel open enough to kind of like talk to the organization or Nick and say, like, this is the issue that I'm dealing with, so this is where we're going to have to kind of navigate some things, and it might mean that I will email Nick in the morning and kind of need a response in the afternoon, and I know that that's not how he or a lot of people should work, but that is how the civil service can work. And I guess it's that understanding from my side of knowing when do I really need something quickly, and when do I not, so that I'm not constantly just sending Nick emails asking question after question. And I think that then kind of develops that relationship to kind of ensure that going forward you both know where the other one's coming from and you've got that shared goal, but you're just having to deal with slightly different barriers on either side.
Just
Okay.
to quickly add as well, I think the communication they both touched upon, but I think from a researcher's perspective as well, it's also asking questions about the things you don't understand, because you can sort of step into policy and not understand immediately how the whole thing works, how the framework works, and just being able to say, this is something I know nothing about, but tell me how it works so I can bring my expertise in, I think is quite key. And Mark was great in answering the millions of questions I posed to him. And I think that made for a really good working relationship. But the other thing I just wanted to highlight is that we don't have to wait for policymakers to ask. I think more and more as we do research projects, we're thinking about how best to bring in impact. So we're developing policy briefs. One side of what do we know, where are the uncertainties, and what do we need to prioritize? Those sort of information, I think, always helps with researchers and us volunteering that information. But we do need to identify the right person within the policy sphere to engage with to do that.
Okay, so the next question is, how can we get more early to mid-career researchers involved in policy? There's a bias towards more senior academics. Are there any particular schemes you know of, particularly ones aimed at senior academics, sometimes it seems the best way to engage with policy is through secondment or internship, but without having those connections in place, it can be hard to access. Just from my experience here, I have got about 7 or so PhD students just sitting off to my right there who are all on fellowship seconded to post at the moment, and we have a number seconded to select committees as well. And the BES fellowship is going to open on Tuesday next week, and we run a range of fellowships from different funders all across the year. And we also have more senior academics through an academic fellowship paid for usually by impact funding at different universities, and that's all the way from mid-career through to professors. And the best way to stay abreast of what's going on is there's our knowledge exchange unit puts out a newsletter every week, and you can sign up for that, and it'll let you know when fellowships open. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
Very, very quickly, the UKRI have started doing policy fellowships for PhD students as well, and that's across a range of organisations, and it's definitely worth looking at those in addition to the ones done by Post and BES. So just to flag that up as well.
Yeah, and they certainly include the Government Office for Science. I don't know if Defra does the PhD ones as well. All right, so the next question is what are the current policy issues that ecologists and policymakers are working on, and how can we contribute to the policy making process? Who wants to start with that one?
I can give it a go. I mean, from my experience currently, the environmental improvement plan is our kind of driving force, I suppose. That's directing us to the actions that we're wanting to take, and that kind of then, so within that there are different chapters, and thriving plants and wildlife is the apex chapter. So like each area is going to have its own priority as to what the current policy is working on. For me, it's the biodiversity targets. In terms of how someone could contribute to the policy making process, that is quite difficult, because there isn't necessarily any one pathway in which you can kind of get your research to National Biodiversity Evidence Team. But I think it's also not just looking at how do I get to Defra, but like Natural England, Environment Agency, there are multiple organisations that work with Defra, and we work very closely with them and have regular meetings with them. So if there is a particular piece of work that you think is particularly geared towards one of those organisations and what they've set out is that what they're doing, then it will probably come through to Defra as a result. So don't think you just have to kind of get through to Defra on an environmental thing. It can come through via different, maybe less obvious and direct ways. And as well, by going through that process, you're potentially kind of building the policy into it, because people at Natural England are also that kind of that link between evidence and policy, and so they can work to kind of see how that can feed into the areas that they know are currently kind of a priority or being worked on. So yeah, I think my main thing would just don't think you have to get through to the main team straight away.
So one thing I would particularly point out that is definitely coming up in lots of places at the moment is multifunctional land use. So this has been looked at by the House of Lords Built Environment Committee. It's also cropped up in the House of Lords Environment and Climate Change Inquiry on protected areas that's going on at the moment. Defra are supposed to be producing a land use framework, and how you actually achieve this and do this in a joined up way seems to be becoming quite a challenging topic.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk, Steve?
Yeah, so I mean, I was going to say that. I mean, it's difficult for me now because having stepped outside Defra, Forestry Commission is a sort of arm's length, despite being a government department. Defra are our parent department. But I think the issue that we've got links to what Hannah says. The EIP sets a range of different targets, and actually, if you look at them all together, it envisages a massive amount of change to the way that we manage land. So it's not just biodiversity. We've got ambitions to increase the area of woodland. We've got ambitions to address water, sediment loading, phosphorus, nitrogen, and all of that requires land use change. You add that to requiring kind of housing and everything else. I don't know that we've got a sort of a sense at the moment of what the future of the countryside looked like, and how people would respond to different kind of scenarios. And as Johnny says, that it's been on the agendas of a number of House of Lords inquiries, and Defra are producing a land use framework, but that doesn't mean that there can't be a sort of wider scientific debate about what the future of the countryside looks like and what that means for us and what that means for food production or farming or housing or anything else. So I think there's a big scientific component to an issue that has also got a political and economic aspect as well.
Yeah, and there are obscure parts of government you probably never heard of. The Geospatial Commission, is it? Looking at how to pull together data to actually inform this sort of thing. So there are lots of things going on. Yeah, the next question is, what is the best way to identify and connect with the relevant policymakers across the civil service and government, which is not always easy. Certainly trying to dig out people, things like email will be challenging, but there are some well-known figures you can approach, like chief scientific advisors, for instance. But sometimes you might need to go through other bodies like the BES who may have those connections. So, but does anybody else want to comment on that one?
I'd make a very brief observation that even after 3 to 5 years working quite closely with Defra and with Natural England, I still have only the vaguest understanding of how all of the different teams fit together. It's absolutely bewildering. The internal structures are quite they're not really apparent to those who aren't on the inside.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, Mark, sorry.
Yes, it was quite a sort of lead in on that one. I mean, I think there is a lot of change within government, and obviously when you get a complete change of government, I mean, the amount of change that's going to happen in a very small amount of time is enormous. But I think what I would say is maybe 3 things. So one, there are existing structures by which government accesses scientific advice, and some of those structures are sort of involve the whole sort of political infrastructure. So you've got House of Lords inquiries, you've got things like the Office of Environmental Protection now set up and doing its own call for evidence, things like that. So there are formal processes where scientific bodies can input information and evidence. You've got the networking point that Hannah made before. So within government, there are science careers, and those people have networks, and they will go to existing events where you can talk, and you can talk about the changes, and you can talk about the direct impact. So there's, and then the third one is that there are commissioners. Defra are always commissioning evidence. How do we meet the targets? How do we monitor the targets? And I think that's actually quite a good way in. So although it's a bit of a sort of customer-client relationship, actually that initiates a dialogue, and it normally brings in wider people. So I think that would be my advice. You know, it's old-fashioned, but networks with the sort of science leaders within the civil service is really important, and just use the existing structures, and I should say by structures, things that are set up by government, but things that are also set up internationally. I've talked before about ITBES being really influential, and actually, you know, a huge number of scientists from around the world worked on that. It wasn't just senior scientists. So it's a great way in. It's brilliant for your career development if you can get on one of those things, even in a peripheral role, and they do have impact.
Yeah,
Just
so that
quick addition, sorry, Johnny, in from a mid and early career perspective, I think sometimes people lack the confidence to put themselves forward to be authors or reviewers of evidence synthesis. So I would encourage any early career researchers, mid-career researchers there who think they might have the expertise but not the confidence to actually put yourselves forward for ITBES or any evidence synthesis requests that come through.
So just on the shoe on the other foot is, what is the best way for policymakers to communicate with academics about the evidence gaps that need filling, especially for small scale short projects? So we see that the big way is in the areas of research interest that departments put out, but having been an evidence-based manager in a department before previously, it is not always. It's always easy to get hold of consultants, not necessarily easy to get hold of the right academic. Anyone else want to make a suggestion to the policymakers looking for the right academic out there? Nope. Answers came then, none. Okay.
I think, sorry, I mean, it's a difficult question, because I think there's something about having a good network within the civil service as well, because there are networks and groups. We've for example got a natural scientist group within my directorate, and so it's having other scientists that you can go to within the civil service to kind of use that as an avenue as well. I mean, there are people that have been in the civil service for 40 years, and they know things that maybe the majority don't. And I think it's just being aware of having those conversations with other policymakers as well, because they may well have come across a similar issue and kind of gone down a certain way that worked or didn't work. But yeah, I would say look within the civil service experience as well.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it seems to me to be the other side of the coin from the question that we've just talked about. I mean, you know, it's networks and existing structures. So policymakers and science advisors within kind of policy or within government bodies need to maintain those networks, so that they have access to scientists, because if they don't, they won't be as effective. And policymakers need to keep those lines of communication open. I can't sort of stress how important these kind of formal groups like the Science Advisory Committee were. And okay, possibly there we are dealing with more senior academics, but they are drawing on a vast kind of wealth of scientific information and publications. So I think policy makers do that, and I think it's important that they continue to. I have less influence now than I used to.
Okay. On that, we are out of time, so I'm just going to say I would like to thank you for your thought-provoking questions, and Deepa, Mark, Hannah and Nick for being on our panel today and your insightful answers. For more information on the BES, go to the britishecologicalsociety.org or follow the British Ecological Society on Twitter. The BES is a great resource for civil servants who need to find out an expert on any aspect of ecology, and the contact emails for their policy team are on the website. And I think that's probably it, unless there's anything that needs to be added.